chances are you probably just bought a mirrorless camera and you have no idea how to use it. In today's video, I want to go over the basic things that you should be aware of just to get you set up so you can start shooting your own short videos, maybe start your social media career, or just do this as a hobby and something to capture your family memories. Whatever you decide to do, I want to make sure you get the best possible quality. Let's talk about it. Okay, so let's start with a couple of ground rules. So this is not going to be a short video. I'm going to try to keep it as short as I can, but there's going to be a lot of details. The important thing to remember is chapters are included. So if you already know some of this information, or if you're not necessarily interested in certain aspects of what we're going to be teaching today, great. Skip along, find sections of the video that you like. Again, chapters are included, so feel free to just move around. The other thing I want to talk about is today I have a Sony a7S III. Yes, Sony a7S III is different than a Canon or a Fuji or whatever, a Nikon, but really it's going to be pretty similar between camera manufacturers. Might be slightly different. It's important for you to get familiar with your particular brand of camera, whatever it is that you're using, and understand the menu settings a little bit. Generally, they're going to be the same, so hopefully you'll be able to follow along and replicate what I'm doing. So let's just start with the first thing. The very first thing that I want you to be aware of and focus on is understanding the cinematic look, which is basically 24 frames per second. We're not going to dive into the theory behind it or why Hollywood likes to use it or what makes it so cinematic. Just know from a high level that it's the most natural motion blur to the human eye, right? It replicates a natural feel and look. It's right in the center. It's not giving you like a really rushed anxiety action camera look, but it's also not giving you like a really slow, dreamy, on some sort of drug effect, right? So it's a really good middle ground. So 24 frames per second. You're gonna set your menu settings to record whatever it is, HD, 4K, to 24p. And now it's a good time to introduce the three aspects that I want to focus on. We're going to be taking a look at shutter, aperture, and ISO. Let's talk about shutter speed. So because we're going to be filming in 24p, 24 frames per second, the general rule of thumb, we want to get the 180 degree rule, which again, it's just giving you that motion blur for that particular frame rate. And later on, we'll talk about slow motion. We're not there yet, but if you want to shoot in slow motion, we'll talk about that a little bit later, so hang tight. But right now we're talking about just filming, normal mode, right? You always want to take the frame rates, 24, and double it, 50, and that's going to give you the shutter. And the shutter is always going to be a fraction, 1 over that number, 1 over 50. So if you're shooting at 24p, 24 frames per second, doubling that, the closest you're going to get to that is 50. Some cameras, it may be 60, some cameras, it may be 40, but most cameras you can get 1 over 50. That's your fraction, 1 over 50. Lock that in. Your shutter, if you're shooting 24p, will always be 1 over 50, and that's going to give you the normal cinematic look. If you decide to take a creative decision later on and slow it down or make it more jittery or whatever, that's a creative decision. But right now, the basics, we're locking in at 1 over 50 for the shutter. Don't change it. Now the big three that I mentioned, shutter, aperture, and ISO, also controls how much light you're going to let in and other things. So shutter is also going to control the motion blur like we just talked about right now. How rushed or slow paced your video is going to feel, right? But the next thing we're going to talk about is aperture. Aperture, again, all three of them will control light, but aperture now will also control depth of field. How blurry do you want the background? Right? How in focus do you want the background? How in focus do you want everything? Do you want the subject to be in focus, everything else blurred out to really hone in on whatever it is that you're trying to capture? Or let's say you're doing a product video, right? And you want to capture everything. Well, now you want a lot of things in focus, right? So here's where it kind of gets a little confusing, but just hang tight. So when you lower the aperture, you're actually opening up the lens, which is allowing more light, and the background's gonna be more blurry. And that's gonna make your subject more in focus, everything else is gonna be blurred out. So f2.8, That's a lower aperture, which lets in more light, makes things more blurry. When you raise the aperture, when the number's greater, so 5.6, 7.1, 11, whatever, now the lens is closing. Think of your eyes squinting and it's more in focus, right? It's focusing on everything, right? It's trying to get everything in focus, but you're not letting in as much light. So that is going to be a creative decision on you. But if you want to let in more light for low light situations, and you want to get that cinematic look where the background is blurred, but the person or the subject is in focus, then you lower the aperture, right? I do want to say one thing regarding light. Yes, all three of these manipulate light and how much light is going into the camera and how much exposure you have. And this is why it's important. That's why we're locking the shutter and we're playing with the aperture. And we'll talk about ISO later, but you shouldn't rely on them to compensate for light. This is why lights are extremely important, probably more important than the camera that you purchased. You can buy the most expensive camera in the world, but if your lighting sucks, you're not going to have good footage. And the other thing I want to talk about in regards to lighting, invest in lighting, at least a 2-point lighting system, which just means 2 panels of light. But really, if you can go 3-point lighting system, 3 panels of light, that's really going to give you a lot of light for most of you to get whatever it is that you want to get done. But also a 3-point lighting system will play with shadows a lot, and that's a whole video on itself. But what I'm trying to say here is, even if you're doing product photography or if you're just doing like content creation, you have to invest in lighting. You can't depend on just the camera settings, because as you can see, some of them are going to be locked and we're not going to play with them, or they're going to dramatically change your style of video, which is something that you may not want. The last thing we're going to talk about is ISO. Think of ISO as being the sensitivity of light that you allow into the camera. How sensitive is your sensor? So I don't know about you guys, but have you ever like woken up in the morning and then you open up the blinds and it's too bright and you're kind of like putting your hand up in front of you? That's how cameras are. So when you play with the ISO, you're playing with how sensitive the sensor is going to be to light, how much of that light is going to pick off and how much of it is going to just like block off, right? So the higher the ISO, the more light you let in. However, the grainier the image, the more sensitive the camera is, and there's a certain limit that all cameras have where they're too sensitive now and it starts to grain and it's not as clear as it should be. The less the ISO, generally speaking, the less grainy the image is, but there's a caveat and we'll get to that. Every camera has its base ISO, or they might have multiple ISOs. The base ISO is the camera manufacturer basically saying, if you keep your ISO here, you're gonna get the best possible image, right? Still dependent on you, but we're giving you the best chance possible where you're not gonna get that much grain, hopefully, and you're gonna get a very clear image and you're gonna have a decent amount of light. For certain picture profiles, there's a minimum, right? There's a minimum ISO of 600 or whatever. The important thing for you to know is, and you have to know what your base ISO is for your camera, but it's safe to say that you want to stay between, let's say 640, 800 to no more than like 2000, I would say. Because anything greater than that on most cameras is going to start to get really degraded. Anything lower than that, it's not going to be the best image, right? It's going to look kind of action camera-y. But that's very dependent on your camera, right? The Sony a7S III, when I'm shooting in a log profile, that's another video, my ISO will live on 640. And honestly, for the majority of stuff that I do, I try to keep it at 640 unless we are really, really, you know, suffering when it comes to light and we're going to raise the ISO. Also, the Sony a7S III has dual ISO. 640 is the base ISO, and then the other base ISO is 12,800, which is really high. And that is like another boost from the manufacturer to allow you to get more light in. That's a special circumstance. A lot of cameras are doing that nowadays. Some of them have 3 base ISOs, but not all of them have that. So figure out where you're at. Again, you really need to invest in lights. That's really what's going to help you get the best image possible, because generally speaking, your ISO, you want to keep it in the medium, in the middle, right? Not too low, not too high, in the middle. That's the sweet spot. There's one more thing that I want to talk about. What if you're in a situation where you are in a area that has way too much lights? Like today, we're outdoors, a really sunny day. How do you control your lights, right? How do you control these aspects? You don't want to raise your shutter, right, to compensate. to limit some of the lighting, and then all of a sudden now you're going to get a really like jittery action camera look. I mean, you invested $3,000, let's say, for this camera to get a better image, and now all of a sudden your $3,000 camera is no better than a GoPro. Well, okay. Or maybe you're going to be like closing that lens up, right? Making sure that there's not a lot of light going in. So you're going to raise the aperture to 7, 12, f12 or f whatever, the highest it will go. And now everything's in focus and you lost that cinematic look, that depth of field that everyone wants. You don't want to do that. And then your last option is, well, you're going to bring down the ISO as much as you can go, but it's still too bright. So what do? Well, just like our eyes need help sometimes during really bright days, your camera is going to need some sunglasses. Just kidding. But you've probably noticed that there's something on the front of my lens here. This little screw-on thing that kind of looks like sunglasses. Well, this is called an ND filter, a variable ND filter. You're actually controlling how much shade you're giving the lens, and you're letting in more light or limiting the light as you rotate it, a variable ND. If there is one accessory I can convince you to buy, it would be a variable ND, especially if you're going to be shooting outdoors and a lot of light. Now you can also diffuse the light. You can get curtains and other things, and I've made a video on that and I'll link it below if you're interested. But really a variable ND almost always lives on my camera when I'm shooting outdoors. And I shoot outdoors a lot because I have a cooking channel as well. So we're barbecuing out here and so forth. It's a huge, huge lifesaver. It allows you now to limit the light going in without compromising your settings, without compromising ISO, shutter, or aperture. That's the creative look that or creative decisions that you decided to do. You don't have to change them. Again, I have an entire video on ND filters, controlling the light, diffusion, all that stuff. I highly recommend it, and I'll link it below.
So as promised, what about slow motion? Well, depending on your camera, you may have several different options for frame rates. The Sony a7S III has 120 and 60p. Most cameras will have 60p, so let's use that as an example today. You're going to set your frame rates to 60p. So what about your shutter? A lot of folks make the mistake of doing 1/60. Again, your shutter's always double the frame rate. So in this particular case, 1/125 will be the closest thing to double my frame rate. And that's going to give me great slow motion.
That's basically it for today's video, guys. Let me know if there's anything you want to dive deeper into, or if there's some other aspects of videography that you want to talk about. I hope this was really helpful for you. I hope this at least got you started with your brand new DSLR or mirrorless camera. And if you have any questions, leave me a comment below and I'll try to do my best to answer them. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative. And if you did, please consider subscribing and joining our channel memberships. I'll catch you in the next video.